If the first step is so small it feels embarrassing, what if that is exactly why it changes everything? Because the fantasy says you need a total life overhaul, but the truth might be that your next breakthrough starts with something almost insultingly simple. And that idea is way more dangerous than it sounds, because once you see it, the whole game of motivation changes. So let's get into the conversation that makes tiny action feel bigger than a grand plan. He is basically saying, stop trying to fix your whole life today. That's weirdly comforting and also annoying. Because everyone wants the superhero comeback montage. And he is like, no, sit up for 30 seconds first. 30 seconds is such a disrespectfully small goal. But that is exactly why it works. People get stuck because the first step feels humiliating. Like admitting you're at the bottom is already half the battle. Nobody wants their first win to be opening a drawer. But then the drawer is the dragon, apparently. That vacuum cleaner story is brutal. He left it at the doorway and just stepped over it for a week. That is the most human failure imaginable. And somehow it is still progress. That is the part people miss. The first move is not victory, it's motion. And motion compounds like crazy. Tiny effort, giant ego death. He keeps making the same point in different costumes. Make it small enough that you will actually do it. That is the whole philosophy, honestly. And it is hard because people want the perfect plan. Perfect plans are just fancy avoidance. Bro, that line should hurt more than it does. The voluntary part matters too. He keeps insisting you cannot force the change, which is frustrating if you're the helper. But if the person does not choose it, it is fake. And fake change collapses fast. That's why exposure therapy lands so hard. You do not throw someone into the ocean. You do not say conquer your fear of elevators. Good luck. You start with pictures, then distance, then a foot forward. That's so clean. And also so emotionally expensive. Because the fear is not the elevator. It's death and humiliation, which is a pretty rude combo. Like the mind really said, let's make this cinematic. And once you see that, the problem gets honest. That's the thing with anxiety. It throws shadows before it throws facts. So the first job is not bravery. It's clarity. And that is why he keeps coming back to listening. Because you cannot help the wrong problem. People always want to jump to the fix. Especially men. Yeah, because fixing feels like usefulness. But listening is the actual power move. Not the talky kind either. The annoying kind where you keep asking until it makes sense. That is rare in real life. Because people hear a problem and panic about their own role in it. Or they get defensive and start performing. Or they become the solution guy instantly. Solution guy is such a dangerous species. What stood out to you most there? The part where the issue was not the issue. That work story was huge. She thought she hated the job. But she missed being close to real challenge. That is such a different diagnosis. She did not want less work. She wanted more meaning. Or at least more contact with the important stuff. Basically, she wanted to be near the front line again. That is wild because the fix looked like leaving, and it turned out to be repositioning. Closer to pressure, closer to purpose. I think people underestimate how much suffering is misread. They call it burnout when it is actually starvation. Or call it anxiety when it is really isolation. Exactly, and then the solution is backwards. So you buy a treadmill and nothing changes. That's offensively accurate. The humility piece is also interesting. He makes humility sound practical, not holy. Like accepting that you are not starting at zero. You're starting from damage, which is harder but also truer. And then there is this weird social layer. When one person starts changing, everyone else resists. Especially families. Because your new behavior exposes the old madness. The drawer was never the drawer. The drawer was lineage, trauma, and bad housekeeping. That sounds funny until you realize it's true. And then the person feels crazy for being blocked. When really the system is hostile to change. That's why tiny steps matter socially too. They are survivable. They do not trigger the whole battlefield at once. Until the battlefield notices, of course. And then you renegotiate again. That experimental language is really strong. Because it turns life into feedback, not identity. That's a big distinction. If the task fails, you are not a failure. You just made the wrong step size. And that is way easier to recover from. It also explains why people spiral. They make one big impossible promise and break it. Then they call themselves useless, which is terrible project management. Brutally terrible. The better question is, what can you do today, voluntarily, without lying to yourself? That's the real discipline. Not intensity, honesty. And I like that he keeps grounding it in real people. Because the theory is good, but the room story makes it stick. The room story is unforgettable. All right, this is the kind of conversation that sneaks up on you. You think it's about cleaning a room, and then it's about becoming yourself. Annoyingly profound, that. Let's keep going next time, because the listening part gets even messier. And episode 2 is where it starts to get really interesting. The crazy part is he turns recovery into something embarrassingly small. Like the universe is telling you to sit up for 30 seconds. And that is insulting in the best possible way. People want a miracle, and he hands them a chair. But that is why it lands. Because the first win is real. Exactly. And he keeps saying the humiliation is part of the path. That part hit hard because people hate being told they are that far gone. Nobody wakes up wanting their breakthrough to start with one drawer. Yet that is basically the whole philosophy. What I like is he does not pretend the small step is cute. He says it is small because the person is actually small right then. That is brutal, but it is also kind. The word he keeps circling is voluntary, and that matters a lot. Because if it is forced, the person is not building themselves. They are just being managed, which is the least inspiring form of self-improvement imaginable. But do you buy the idea that it is exponentially accelerating that fast? I buy the momentum part, but the exponential thing feels a little evangelical. Yeah, that sounded like recovery wearing a rocket pack. Still, the principle is solid because competence does stack. One successful action makes the next one less abstract. And then suddenly you are not just thinking about change, you are doing it. That is the real shift, from fantasy to contact with reality, and from shame to evidence. Evidence is a very rude thing to shame. The client stories are wild because they are so unglamorous. The vacuum cleaner in the doorway is such a perfect image. He did not even enter the room and still counted it as progress. But that is exactly why the story works. The action is tiny, but the psychological battle is enormous. And that is the part of people outside miss when they say, just do it. That phrase should honestly come with a fine. Just do it is what people say when they do not understand the map. He is saying the map might start with a single drawer. And he keeps linking that to family systems, which is where it gets sticky. Because sometimes the room is not messy by accident. Sometimes cleaning it up threatens the whole household weirdness. The dragon in the family closet is a ridiculous image, but it works. It explains why a simple task can trigger ancient resistance. And then the smallest act becomes morally loaded. Like, if I vacuum the room, I am betraying the whole system. Exactly. And that is why a clinician has to go even smaller. I loved that he kept saying the real first step might be looking at the drawer. Imagine that as your life assignment for the week. But honestly, that is more honest than pretending you can rebuild instantly. And he makes the same move with fear. Exposure therapy is just the courage version of tiny steps. Because the dragon is not the elevator, it is the death fantasy around it. And the humiliation fantasy, which is even more social and nasty. That is such a human nightmare, dying badly in public. Our brains are theater kids with trauma. That is actually insulting to theater kids. What I appreciated is he does not let the fear stay vague. He keeps forcing it into images, distances, and thresholds. Like, how far down the hall can you look at the elevator? That is a much more usable question than are you ready to be brave? Which is a question nobody has ever answered honestly. And this is where he gets useful beyond therapy. Because the listening part is basically the same in work and relationships. People always want the fix, but he is obsessed with the diagnosis. And I think that is where most people get impatient. They hear pain and immediately reach for a solution grenade. A solution grenade is exactly what that feels like. But he is right that the wrong fix can be a disaster. Especially when the real problem is hidden under 6 fake ones. That part about listening without assuming you know is huge. He basically says shut up until the problem reveals itself. Which is terrible advice for a lot of men. And probably excellent advice for a lot of marriages. Because when he talks about women laying out all the possible threats, that felt precise. Not flattering, but precise. The male instinct is to jump in and look competent, and then accidentally become a decorative obstacle. That is so cruelly accurate. He is basically saying competence without listening is narcissism in a blazer. That is one of your best insults yet. What did you make of the colleague example? Because that was the cleanest demonstration of the point. 30 minutes later, and the whole story had changed. And the issue was not the issue, it was meaning. That is what people always miss, the emotional economy underneath the complaint. She was not really leaving the job, she was leaving a feeling. Or maybe leaving the loss of significance, which is way scarier than bad tasks. And then suddenly the fix is proximity, not promotion. Right? Back near harder problems, back near the center of gravity. She did not want less work. She wanted more meaning. That is such a good reminder for anyone managing people. Because people rarely say, make my life more significant. They usually say, I hate this role, which is much easier to invoice. The weirdest thing is how much of this comes down to asking the right question. Not the smartest question, the right one. And then staying with the answer long enough for the person to hear themselves. That takes patience most people do not have, especially not when they think they are the hero in the room. The hero reflex is probably the biggest enemy here, because helping is not the same as performing helpfulness. Exactly, and he keeps dragging us back to humility, which is annoying because humility is always the answer. And nobody wants that answer on a mug. Still, the core of it is clear. Small, voluntary steps, careful listening, and reality over fantasy. That is a very unglamorous rescue plan. And probably why it actually works. We should leave it there before we turn into motivational wallpaper. Fair, because the next part gets even trickier. In episode 2, we get into the messiest part of listening and trust. The brutal part is that the fix is almost offensively small. People want a cinematic turnaround, not a drawer. But a drawer is where the whole war starts, apparently. And that is the weird genius of it. Because the tiny step is not tiny to the person inside it. That humiliation is doing a lot of hidden work. Like, congratulations, you touched the vacuum cleaner. Which sounds like a joke until your life is on fire. And that's why people miss the point when they mock self-help. The issue is not inspiration, it's traction. Once traction starts, the whole thing compounds. He basically described momentum like a chemical reaction. Not magic, just a sequence that finally catches. And that sequence has to be voluntary or it collapses. That part matters more than people want to admit. If the person does not own the step, it is just compliance. And compliance is not healing, it is just paperwork with feelings. That is wildly accurate and deeply annoying. What he keeps insisting on is agency. Not in some cheesy hustle way, but in the real sense. Can you reliably do one thing today that you chose? Because if not, you are not even in the game yet. And that is why the room cleaning advice hits so hard. People heard a meme, but he meant a moral threshold. Can you make order in 1 square foot of chaos? If yes, the universe just got slightly less hostile. If no, then okay, we shrink it again. That shrinking is not defeat, it is strategy. Sometimes strategy looks a lot like mercy. And I think that is why the humiliation point lands. Because the real enemy is the ego screaming for grand gestures. Ego wants a comeback montage, not 30 seconds upright. But 30 seconds upright is how comebacks start. Then there is the exposure therapy side, which is even better. Because fear always pretends to be about the object itself. But the elevator is never just an elevator. It becomes death, shame, loss of control all at once. The mind really does build a horror movie out of plumbing, and then calls it a personality trait. The genius of gradual exposure is that it respects the fear. It does not insult the nervous system by rushing it. It says, okay, we will stand 10 feet away first. Then 8 feet, then 5, then maybe a look. That is how confidence becomes evidence, not fantasy. Because the body learns before the philosophy catches up. Which is inconvenient for people who love talking more than doing. Yeah, the podcast industrial complex does not like that message. But it is true across almost everything difficult. Public speaking, gym, conversations, grief, all of it. You do not conquer a dragon by insulting it from across the room. Though to be fair, some people try. And then wonder why the dragon is still there. What I loved was his point that looking away makes it worse. Because avoidance feels like relief but acts like fertilizer. That is the most unfair part of anxiety. Every move you make to escape it can feed it. So the move is not bravery in the movie sense. It is precision and tolerance, which is less sexy and more useful. Nobody is making a superhero poster out of that. But that is exactly why it works for real people. And then he pivots into listening, which is where this gets dangerous. Because now the ego is not just lazy, it is helpful in the wrong way. The classic male disease of solving the wrong problem fast. Fast, confident, and completely beside the point. But he is not even making it a gender war. He is saying threat detection needs space before action. First, you listen for the shape of the fear. Then you stop pretending you already know the answer. Which is hard for bosses, husbands, consultants, and basically everyone. Honestly, yes, especially consultants. The really sharp part is that the wrong problem can look very noble. You can rush in to help and still be avoiding the truth. Sometimes generosity is just panic in a suit. A tailored suit, but still panic. That line is going to haunt me. What he described with the colleague was basically diagnostic patience. Keep asking until the story stops contradicting itself. And then the issue turns out to be meaning, not workload. That is such a human trap. People narrate symptoms because the real thing feels too exposed. And the listener has to be calm enough to let that happen. That is why he keeps saying shut up, basically. In the nicest possible clinical way. And the payoff is that clarity itself becomes relief. Because once the problem is named correctly, 95% is gone. That is almost unfair to all our dramatic suffering. Imagine being tormented for 6 months by a misdiagnosis and a bad meeting. The mind is always at least partly a badly run office. And then there is that point about confronting what is humiliating. Because the smallest step often feels like admitting total defeat. But it is actually the first honest act. I think that is the spine of the whole argument. Not self-esteem first, not clarity first, not motivation first. Just a truthful next move you can actually do. Annoyingly modest, but absurdly effective. Which is probably why people either ignore it or worship it. I like that he never romanticizes suffering. He respects how messy and patterned it is. And he respects that people are usually not broken in one piece. They are broken across habits, relationships, and fear. Which is a much harder fix, obviously. And a much worse thumbnail. All right, we should have probably let that land. The next part gets even messier because trust enters the room. And once trust shows up, every tiny step starts to mean something else. That's the part people miss, that a tiny step is never actually tiny. It is a direct hit on the whole system that scared them in the first place. Which is rude, honestly, because now even a drawer becomes a battlefield. And somehow the vacuum cleaner is suddenly a moral event. But that humiliation is the point, because it tells you where reality starts. People hate that word because it sounds like punishment, but it's actually precision. Like, can you really rebuild confidence without first admitting you're at 0? No, apparently we all prefer pretending we're at 72 and mildly blocked. Exactly, and then wonder why the whole thing keeps collapsing. What he keeps saying underneath all the examples is, voluntary effort changes identity. Because once you choose the step starts choosing back? Yes. And that is why exposure therapy feels almost magical when it works. Not because the fear disappears, but because the person learns they can stay present. And because the dragon was usually just a hallway with bad lighting. That is an outrageously good description of anxiety, by the way. The terrifying thing is never just the elevator, it's death, shame, and exposure. And the fix is to find the exact distance where the fear is tolerable? Right. The edge where confidence and threat are finally in the same room. That is such a clean image because it respects the pace of actual recovery. People keep trying to brute force meaning when they need to listen for it. And that listening part is brutal because it strips away your ego fast. The true skill is shutting up long enough to become useful, which for many people is basically a spiritual practice. And in relationships, that seems to be the whole war, right? One person wants a solution, the other wants the whole threat map laid out. And the guy thinks he is helping while actually skipping the entire diagnosis, which is a very expensive misunderstanding, emotionally speaking. The weird miracle is that once the real issue is named, most of the noise evaporates. That's why meaning can be the actual fix, not just a nice extra. People don't always need a new life first, they need a truthful one. And then the next step becomes obvious enough to survive. Not easy, just survivable. which is already huge. All right, let's leave it there and come back into the relationship side next. Because that's where the listening gets personal very quickly. And in episode 2, we're digging into why helping someone can make everything worse first.